Well, good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium and happy Victory Day. There were tens of thousands of people in the streets of Moscow today. Proclamations were issued actually by President Donald Trump on yesterday, that is May 8th, which is VE Day for the West, May 9th, Victory Day, partly because of the time differential when the Nazis surrendered. And for those of you who think I may not know, I know that that song, Tri Tankista, is actually from 1938 when the three friends in a tank repelled the Japanese invasion of Siberia, but it later became the anthem of the border patrol of the Soviet Union and then Russia. I think people take it a little faster now, more victoriously. But of course, all of the people in the chorus singing were not so familiar with the Russian words. So you see us staring down and looking at it. But it's really quite remarkable. There was a discussion today on Helga Zepp-LaRouche's International Peace Coalition where former CIA analyst Larry Johnson pointed out that the Russian people, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, lost about 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6 people massive. In the United States, the 400,000 that we lost in World War II accounted for 1/10 of 1% of the population. So literally, if you are Russian, you know multiple people, you have multiple relatives that you know of who perished in that war. And therefore, the victory over fascism is very personal, as is the admonition, never again. So here we are 80 years later, and we have a revival of Nazism in Ukraine, which was funded, promoted, and exploited by NATO, particularly the British, particularly the previous Biden administration, and frankly, Obama, for a war based on geopolitical principles to weaken or destroy Russia. One of the main reasons why President Trump won the election is that he pledged to end that only a moron could not perceive that a proxy war using Ukraine against Russia could lead to the thermonuclear annihilation of the entire human race. Trump has expressed his intent to end the war. There is an enormous amount of propaganda and disinformation swirling, confusing matters, but it looks like that is the intention, and hopefully it will move forward. And the British are doing every dirty trick that they can, including blowing up the situation between India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers. And I know many people who say, oh, it won't escalate. They don't want to escalate. Once shots are fired, once people are killed, all bets are off. Because first of all, killing another human being is an unnatural act. So in a sense, the idea of Geneva Conventions or rules of warfare, obviously you do want to prosecute war crimes, but it's a little peculiar to say that there's a particularly correct way to kill other human beings when it goes against the very grain of any human emotion or human identity, and we really should be beyond this. Also, let me just say there are rumors swirling around. We'll see what happens, but President Trump is scheduled to go to Southwest Asia, to Saudi Arabia, other places. He is mooting that perhaps there's going to be a peace proposal put forward. It's rumored that he's cutting off Bibi Netanyahu. He's very angry with him. I don't know if this is true or not. What is true is that the people in Gaza and the West Bank have suffered enormously, and that after the initial partial ceasefire right after Trump's election, even prior to his inauguration, the Israelis very shortly after that, I think March 2nd, began another blockade where no food or humanitarian aid has gotten in. You have outright starvation, continued shelling, horrific conditions, so extreme that even in Israel, the truth is seeping out, and many Israelis are protesting the actions of their government, knowing that to continue to slaughter Palestinians in cold blood also jeopardizes the lives of the remaining hostages, and they want an end to this as well. So let's hope that we get there. I wanted to do something today on this Victory Day anniversary, not only to commemorate that, but to continue to educate our viewers on the historic relationship and partnership between the United States and Russia. In the case of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, and very specifically Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin. And to do that, I have Gerald Rose, a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche and very good friend and historian. And Jerry, I'm really glad you could join me, and please go ahead.
Sure. Well, it is one of the most remarkable stories in history. At first, it's somewhat stunning that the man who saved the Republican form of democracy, Franklin Roosevelt, would be the bulwark of actually working with and very closely with Stalin, and those two men together actually defeated fascism. There can be no debate about that. This was the alliance that ultimately defeated the Nazi, the fascist onslaught, and what people don't realize, and Susan Butler wrote a very fascinating book called Anatomy of a Partnership. And it is the only serious detailed study of the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. And she initially, and I can only think why, but she initially was the first one to publish the letters between Stalin and Roosevelt during the war. She put a volume out. Nobody had ever done that before. And she went to the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park and got the letters and published a very small book. But the letters show a very warm appreciation of each other. And one of the most remarkable aspects of the letters is when the invasion, the Barbarossa invasion of the Soviet Union started, in which the Nazis made the onslaught against the Soviet Union. Stalin didn't want to believe it. He just didn't want to believe it. He did not think that Hitler would risk a two-front war. But when it happened, Stalin was beside himself. And the first letters between Roosevelt and Stalin, Roosevelt wrote to Stalin and said, whatever you need, the United States will supply it. Now, Stalin had asked Roosevelt, well, if I publish that in the Soviet Union, people will be totally remoralized, totally, prepared to risk all. They didn't really have much of a choice, but this would have been a remarkable boost to their morale. And what Roosevelt says, look, don't do that. Because if you do that, all hell will break loose in the United States. Because there was an isolationist grouping that said, well, let Europe kill itself. We're not going to get involved. And this was a reaction to what the British had done in World War I and what Woodrow Wilson had done in World War I, which blew up in Wilson's face when he tried to ram down the throat of the US Senate the idea of the League of Nations. So the isolationists had the upper hand in the United States until the Japanese actually dropped the bombs at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had to be extremely circumspect. And the Lend-Lease program, which later was termed the arsenal of democracy, was a so-called, was we were going to get paid back, which of course Roosevelt knew we weren't going to get paid back. You know, Britain had to be fed and armed. But when the invasion of the Soviet Union occurred, in the letter to Stalin, Roosevelt said, "You have a blank check. You tell me what you need, and I assure you it will be there." And this completely transformed Stalin. He said, with the backup of the United States, we can win. If the United States had not done that, had not had a leader like Franklin Roosevelt, which bucked both parties to do this, there's all sorts of British games being played. And the irony, of course, is we know Hitler was a British project that blew up in their face, as was Napoleon. Napoleon blew up in their face. The British ran the Jacobin destabilization of the monarchy, to destabilize all of Eurasia. That was the idea of the Jacobin, so that the American Revolution would not take off in France in particular, but spread itself as it was in Germany and other places. That's a longer story. I won't go into it. Had Franklin Roosevelt, on its own personal executive decision, not sent that first letter to Stalin and delivered on everything. In fact, when Stalin came back with what he wanted, Roosevelt said, "This is nowhere near enough." He said, "No, you need a lot more tanks. You need a lot more of this and that." One of the ironies of this whole relationship, which gives you an insight into these, you know, people think, well, you know, history is events, or it's not. History is not that. I mean, Averell Harriman was the guy who Roosevelt sent to Russia to administer the Lend-Lease program. Now, Averell Harriman and the crowd around him, we know, moved the money into Hitler's coffers. It was his bank that did it. Irony? Complete irony. But at the point that Hitler invaded England, and not before, remember, the Time magazine had in the 1920s made Mussolini the man of the year. And the New York Times and Time magazine praised Hitler to the skies for creating order out of the chaos in Germany. These guys had no problem. Harriman, you know, the actual racial program that the Nazis used was designed by Harriman in the euthanasia the society that he created. But when the situation, when England was being bombed, and not before, they came on their knees to Roosevelt and they said, "You must save us." And Roosevelt knew, as he says, as Elliot Roosevelt reported in the famous As He Saw It book, and this is not speculation. I mean, I knew it without reading the book, but because everything Roosevelt did indicated it. But in the book, Roosevelt said, we had 2 world wars because of colonial rule. And I assure you, as he said to Winston Churchill in Argentina, and then later forced him to sign the Atlantic Charter, which promised the end of colonial rule within a certain short period after the war. But Roosevelt knew who these guys were. But they came on their knees to Roosevelt and they said, "Save us." And Roosevelt said, "This is the price I will save you." And on his own, again, you have to understand, this was a command decision. He didn't go to the Congress and say, "Can we fight this war?" He didn't say that. He said, because of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, because of the mobilization that he had to internally defeat fascism within the United States, and the way he did it, we were in a position to promise Stalin what he needed and delivered on that. But this was before anybody in the Congress, before anybody in his cabinet knew. So Stalin had an incredible respect for Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, it was a profound respect. And in the book, Susan Butler identifies the kind of concessions, like at the Tehran conference, which was in 1943, at the height of the war. Stalin took down the Comintern, which was the international organization of the communist parties throughout Western Europe. And he actually said, "Look, we're in this together. The communist parties of Europe will support 100% Franklin Roosevelt, and we will form alliances with the resistance." They were the resistance in many countries. The communist parties were the resistance. And he took down what Trotsky had set up in terms of the Comintern, what was called the Comintern. Stalin also, at Yalta, made major concessions to Roosevelt. This lie about what happened at Yalta is completely a fabrication, and I'll go through that a little later. But between these two leaders and the understanding what was at stake, they mobilized this country, and they mobilized all of the Soviet Union to fight the most brutal war in history in terms of the killing capacities of both sides, as Diane never stops quoting what Douglas MacArthur said. He said, if we cannot fight another war, we can't do it. The killing capacities are so enormous, particularly with the nuclear weapons. It makes war unthinkable. So between the two, and I just want to get at this Harriman thing, because Harriman was loyal to Franklin Roosevelt.
Harriman?
Harriman was loyal
Really?
to Franklin Roosevelt during the war. That's the irony. Ultimately, had Roosevelt lived, this combination that he put together would not have bucked him. In fact, Stalin was loyal to Franklin Roosevelt. When Roosevelt died, Stalin didn't believe it. And he wanted to open the coffin to find out whether Roosevelt, in fact, was not poisoned. Now, I'm saying history is not what most people think it is. When you have the kind of leadership that is committed to a principle, it inspires even pigs like Harriman. We can't play games on this stuff. Harriman did a brilliant job for Roosevelt because he was totally straight with Stalin. When Stalin, Stalin was a very difficult figure. A very difficult figure. And therefore, Harriman was, with Franklin Roosevelt's backup, would draw the line at certain points to say, look, you're not going to do that. You're just not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Right? We're not going to support that. So the respect, the mutual respect, and the deep collaboration for the principle, guided by Franklin Roosevelt's understanding that 2 world wars were actually created by the British Empire and colonial rule, which guided Roosevelt through the war, the setting up of the Bretton Woods system, the creation at Yalta of the United Nations, were all to one purpose: to end colonial rule. And Stalin was prepared, as he had mobilized 1 million troops on the border of Manchuria, that if there was an invasion of Japan, the Soviets would have, through Kamchatka and other places, would have participated if they had to invade Japan. The whole setting up of the United Nations, Roosevelt not only risked his life, the lies about Yalta are stunning, absolutely stunning. Roosevelt knew if he did not, before the end of the war, if he did not go to Yalta and set up the United Nations, then you would go immediately into the different blocks. Nothing would have been accomplished. And you would have the continuation of the war. So Roosevelt flew and took ships and got to Yalta, roughly 4,000 or 5,000 miles away. His health was not good. Harry Hopkins went with him. The health was not good. Franklin Roosevelt died soon after Yalta. And this lie that, Franklin Roosevelt was sick, he gave away Poland, that's bullshit. If anyone actually knows the story of Poland, hey, come on. The Russians, the Soviets had proposed that France and Britain draw the line at Poland, that all the forces, French, British, Russian forces, would have met the Nazis at the border of Poland with the full might of all 3 nations. And France and Britain refused. So if anyone thinks that this war could not have been stopped, had they done that, Hitler could not have invaded and done what he did. Because the British Empire that created Hitler through Schacht and the Schachtian economics, through the Bank of England, through the Wall Street London nexus, which funded the Nazi Party. All of this is documented. I'm not making this stuff up. So when the Russians, said, you have to, you shouldn't have a buffer between you and Europe, Stalin said, are you kidding me? I just lost 27 million people. And you're telling me I don't need a buffer? When I proposed we wouldn't have a buffer, that in 1939, in the invasion of Poland, that it was, and that's when he signed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, by the way. So all the bullshit about the Hitler-Stalin Pact was when he realized that, in fact, they wanted the Nazis, the fascists, to invade Russia. This is not something that Lyndon LaRouche just came up with. This is the proof. Proof positive, as Putin points out. And half the goddamn Polish government were Nazis. The anti-Semitism in Poland, Auschwitz, was cheered by half the Catholics in Poland. Come on. Don't fall for this Yalta shit. Roosevelt went to Yalta to form the United Nations. That's what Yalta was about. And not only risked his life, in fact, lost his life. It was the United Nations passed the U.S. Senate in the wake of Roosevelt's death because no one, we passed 80-something to 2. I don't know who the 2 were. I never looked it up. But anyway, put 80-something to 2. Because the spirit of what Franklin Roosevelt intended for the end of the war, the end of the colonial empires, the charter of the UN says that. The commitment of Stalin and the Chinese. Because remember, the original Security Council was Russia, China, the United States. They included France, which was a colonial power, and they included Britain. But when Britain opposed China being in the United Nations as part of the Security Council, Roosevelt said, I'm not going to be part of a white man's club. So if you don't let China in, then the U.S. isn't going to be in. And he imposed the combination, the 2 anti-colonial powers, because the Soviet Union had no interest in colonial rule. In fact, Stalin at the end of the war, with Harry Dexter White was in the middle of it, the U.S. was going to make a $10 billion loan, which was enormous in those days, so that the Soviet Union could buy American machine tools to modernize the Soviet Union. That the community of nations committed to an anti-colonial order, post-world order, which was the combination of the Bretton Woods and the founding of the UN, would have created a security and development. You see, people don't realize that there was a whole section of the Bretton Woods negotiations and discussion. It wasn't about monetary policy. That was a part of it. And that's the only part that the British and so-called historians until recently talked about. But there was a proposal made by the Indian delegation to Bretton Woods that there would be an international TVA, that every single valley in the world would be evaluated, and there would be an integrated development proposal based upon the unbelievable successes of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that the first proposal was to take the Danube River, which goes through Western Europe and also into what was Eastern Europe, which was at that point, a Soviet-occupied territory, and to develop in the Danube River an approach like the TVA that would have integrated the economies of Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the Soviet Union in a different way. That the Kuomintang and the Communist Party had proposed at Bretton Woods, the 1919 proposal of Sun Yat-sen to create massive rail development, to create a modern nation in China. This was all part of what the World Bank and the IMF were to, the IMF was to stabilize the currencies. Remember, there were no stable currencies at the end of the war except the dollar. So the IMF was to negotiate the stable currencies, long-term agreements, which was the Bretton Woods Agreement, the settling up in gold and other kinds of things. The World Bank were to fund these projects on the order of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Right? All of that was in place. And the UN was not to be a world government, never was. The British tried to play that game, but it never was a world government. It was the foundation of the sovereign nation states to actually negotiate the kinds of security and development proposals so that we wouldn't face another war. That colonial rule was to be ended. If you don't understand that about Franklin Roosevelt, then you understand nothing about what Roosevelt did with respect to Stalin, with respect to the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, that Roosevelt understood that if you created, as he saw, you see, people don't understand what economics really is. They think development is making people richer or giving them a living standard. That's not what economics is. And Lyndon LaRouche understood it most profoundly, but Roosevelt understood it profoundly. And it was discussed by Lilienthal in his famous book, The March of Democracy, on the TVA. And China understands this most profoundly today. When you face a challenge as a community of nations, or a community as in the TVA, you begin to rely upon the talents of other people. You begin to see them as human beings and their manifest capacities. And in the process of deliberation of developing these capacities, and that's why space is so important, then you recognize in a profound way what the human species is as a species. it's the height of ecumenicism. It actually is. It's a non-religious form of ecumenicism. And therefore, the post-World War was to end the British Empire. Fascism was a spin-off of the British Empire, as was the Napoleonic Wars. There were spin-offs of the British Empire. What Susan Butler points out in her book, in 1943, at the height of the World War II, the British starved 10 million Indians to death. 10 million Indians because of a famine, and they did nothing about it, and they hoarded the food from India to feed their troops. That's the British Empire. So on the one hand, the extraordinary commitment to the future that Franklin Roosevelt had, it was not a defensive war for him. It was a war, a two-front war, one against Britain, who he knew brought the Nazis in. He knew it. He saw two world wars. The first World War, ultimately with the Spanish flu, probably killed more people than the Second World War. It's likely it did. So Roosevelt was fighting a two-front war. He fought one against the British and the British Empire, and he fought one against the Nazis. And he understood Stalin in a way that Stalin didn't understand Stalin. He understood that without Stalin and without Soviet Union and China participating in a new security and development architecture, that you would have hell to pay.
Jerry?
Yeah.
I just, as you're saying this, I'm getting a different idea also about the composition of the UN Security Council and the way that the United States should be functioning. Because you can see under a strong president who was deeply rooted in the American anti-colonial tradition, that the role of the United States on the UN Security Council would be to keep a certain balance. But as we became perverted and, sided with the colonial powers, then the body has become largely dysfunctional. But I can see it might have functioned to actually keep the British and French at bay. And you see how nefarious they are by what they're doing right now to try and undercut the efforts of President Trump to end the Ukraine-Russia war.
Look, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Because look, with all the mishegas and noise and salesmanship, the truth of the matter is you end that war and you have a United States, Russia, China relationship with India involved. It's over. It's over for them. Yes, the role of the United States in founding the United Nations. We didn't, the Soviet form of government was not anything that Franklin Roosevelt and certainly Eleanor could tolerate. They did not.
No, and she talks about that in her book. Her dancing, I would describe it sort of a dance of her and the Soviet Union on her Universal Rights of Man proclamation and all the things she
Yeah,
was
sure,
doing.
sure.
I mean, she really was very, very clear that she had a problem.
Well,
Yeah,
any American would.
right.
Any American would. But that's what I'm saying. We may not like, whatever government, but if they're committed to security and development, future generations, as they grow up in that kind of environment, would tend to modify. Remember, where does government come from? It comes from the people, whatever anyone wants to say. So, yeah, look, if people say, "Oh, I want this perfect union of and people should all agree." I mean, that's fucking crazy. We all have to agree and kumbaya and forget it.
Could you just, because we have maybe about 10 minutes or so
Yeah,
left,
sure.
but obviously after the war ended, everyone in the war knew, and people who had been at Elba, for example, and then knew what happened in Japan and knew who our allies were. This got so turned upside down so very quickly after the death of FDR. And if you would say something
Yeah,
about that.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, one of the most fascinating things is I've done a lot of work on the United Nations and the founding of the United Nations. I haven't written it up and I haven't given it a lecture on it, but give you an example. When Molotov, who was the UN, he was second to Stalin. And in 1945 was the famous UN conference in San Francisco. When Molotov walked in, there was a standing ovation.
Wow.
The Soviet Union properly was understood as the heroes, as the actual on-the-ground heroes of World War II. What they did at Stalingrad, what they did, unbelievable. It's unbelievable what they did. So when he walked into the room, there was a standing ovation. When he spoke at the UN, everybody paid attention and saw them because it was an attempt to get the Argentines into the United Nations initially. And since they had a fascist government and sided with the Nazis, that was not too popular. There's a wild story about it, but anyway. Through pragmatic, ironically, this lunatic, Nelson Rockefeller, was in the middle of this Argentine thing. He was the handler for Roosevelt, ironically, of Ibero-America. Anyway, so Molotov spoke against it. I mean, he was seen as the leader, the anti-colonial leader.
Wow.
The anti-fascist leader. And Harriman turned on Roosevelt and everything Roosevelt stood for. These guys are snakes. You can't trust them. As long as Roosevelt was alive, he did a job for Roosevelt. But he turned on Roosevelt and started briefing everybody that the Soviets were our enemies. And given that he was the ambassador, in effect, to the Soviet Union, I mean, his post-war role was disgusting. Two-faced, disgusting pig, right?
Sounds like Michael McFaul.
Yeah,
ambassador.
exactly. So, so you really, as I said, history is totally ironic. If you know, But when you get somebody like a Lincoln or like a Roosevelt with an incredible sense of mission, you create the principles upon which the basis for is what Helga's talking about, the security and development architecture. It was in the Lady Pondor says, you get with Russia and China, who are now functioning on the basis of a principled commitment to security and quoting the American system of all things to Trump, which is true and very relevant. You have the basis now to completely end the globalized colonization of the world. And that's where we are. That's how you defeat fascism once and for all. And the fascists are really out in the open now. There's nothing left in the imagination about the British at this point. Nothing. And they can be crushed. But we have to play the role, as Helga has taken the point on pulling this together as a fitting commemoration of this great moment in history that we were discussing today.
Well, thank you very much. I heartily agree. I think it's urgent right now for Americans to recognize also who the adversary was and is. Elliot Roosevelt wrote that book already in 1946. He felt that everything had been reversed. That was only a year after the war ended. And so I think people have to ask themselves, how did we get to these strongly held opinions that communist China and Russia, and how many Americans think Russia is still communist to this? I mean, they have no idea. It is actually embarrassing to me. Very frequently, I'm sorry to say, am I embarrassed by speeches given by members of our Congress, whom Helga discovered, many of whom did not even own passports, so they didn't even know. They had never visited the nations which they were talking about. And I'm not saying you can only speak about someplace if you visited there, but if you have never left the borders of the United States, you might have difficulty imagining how the rest of the world perceives us. And as I keep saying, we have to remember we represent less than 4% of the world's population. So this arrogance, it's one thing if we're doing good, if we're representing justice, what FDR did, the massive material that we pumped into people fighting the Nazis, you know, if there's something just that we have done, but to just run around saying for no arbitrary purpose, we are the arbiters of everything on the planet, just really doesn't work.
No, and that's why people trusted Franklin Roosevelt, because he took people as they were and are.
Mm-hmm.
And he guided them with a sense of incredible sense of mission. And he didn't care what their form of government was. He didn't care what their previous commitments were. He said, no. The United Nations is, in fact, just one last thought on this. It was said, and there was reason to believe, that Franklin Roosevelt, had he lived, was not going to serve out as president of the United States. He wanted to be the first president of the United Nations.
Well,
because mankind is mankind.
Yep. Yep, makes total sense. Well, to that end, let me just urge everyone watching, we are, as of tomorrow, we will be exactly 2 weeks, only 2 weeks from what is going to be a historic International Schiller Institute Conference, which will be held in person in the New York City metropolitan area, but also live online. You can visit schillerinstitute.com to register for the conference, to attend in person. And I will say, if you can go in person, everyone knows there are many things that happen in the in-between space that you don't want to miss. And if you can't possibly get there in person, then sign up so that you're sent the links and the alerts so you can watch everything that is happening online, because it is going to be an extraordinary event and it's designed exactly for this moment in history. So thank you again, Jerry, and thanks everybody for watching, and happy Victory Day.
Absolutely. We deserve that kind of happiness. We do.